All right, hello, my name's Jeremy Johnson and I chair the Pupillage Committee at 5 Essex Court, and I'm going to speak with my colleagues on tips for making successful pupillage applications. On my left is Molly Joyce, who was a pupil in Chambers until just a few weeks ago, and she successfully completed her pupillage and was awarded tenancy. And on my right is Remy Reichhold, who also did pupillage in Chambers a year ago, and he's been a tenant for just over a year or so. And all of us practice in Chambers core areas, which are human rights, civil liberties and public law. Remy additionally practices in international law, which is a growing area for Chambers. We're a mid-sized set, around 40 tenants, and we take on 2 pupils each year, very much with a view to making 2 new tenants at the end of the pupillage year. So what I'm going to do is just talk you very briefly through the pupillage process that we run, and then I'm going to ask Molly and Remy for their insights on different stages of the pupillage process. We're very happy to take questions as we go, and we'll try and leave some time at the end for any questions you have. So obviously I'm talking very much from the perspective of the pupillage process we run, but it is, I think, typical of the approach that are taken by many sets of chambers, particularly those who operate within the gateway. Obviously a number of chambers operate outside the pupillage gateway, but the overall process tends to be very similar across the bar. Once the application window is closed, we will gather in all the application forms. We arrange for them to be anonymised, and then they are divided between members of the Pupillage Committee to undertake a paper sift, where each application is marked according to fairly strict and narrow criteria. We operate a consistency check system to make sure that all members of the committee are applying the same criteria in a consistent way. Once that sift has taken place, we aim to select around 30 candidates for first round interviews. Those typically take 15 or 20 minutes, and we ask a variety of questions, legal questions, topical questions, to identify those candidates who will proceed through to the second round. That's a slightly longer interview. It typically involves a piece of advocacy, which we assess, and then at the end of that process, as I say, we aim to select two of the candidates for offers of pupillage. So that's the process in outline. And we'll go through now, I think, from this stage, so in the run-up to making paper applications, right through to second round interview to explore what tips Molly and Remy and myself can offer you. So Molly, let me start with you. We've now got 3 or 4 months before candidates who are going to be making pupillage applications this year have to complete their paper application form, and then the process will run till around April or May next year. What tips do you have for those who are considering making pupillage applications this year for building their CVs both between now and January and indeed throughout the process?
So even though the applications are coming in soon, and there is still quite a lot you can do in these next few months to build your CV up and to bolster it when you're making the application, and then to further bolster it if you get through to an interview. And among those things are, for example, mini pupillages, if you haven't done a mini pupillage, and if you are able to get one before the deadline for the pupillage gateway closes, that will be something that's really important to have on your form. And most pupillage applications and most sets, from my understanding, would expect you to have at least between 1 and 3 up to 4 maybe mini pupillages under your belt, so to have some experience of having actually seen what being a barrister is like. And as I say, the reason for that is to kind of show that you are serious about actually becoming a barrister, and you have experienced what it's going to be like, and to a certain degree. And other things you can do is start thinking about advocacy experience. If you're in university or if you're in the bar course, you can get involved in moots and debates. I know from my experience, this is the kind of time where a lot of those things are coming about, and that's something you could do quite kind of last minute to bolster your application. So that's another thing. Prize essays, essay competitions and prizes. Again, from my experience, there's quite a lot that come up kind of around this time and in the coming months. And again, that's something you could kind of do on the side just to bolster your CV. Other things that you can do is, in terms of, again, that kind of building advocacy experience, if you're in the bar course on the GDL, you could start getting involved in FRU, the Free Representation Unit. And there's also, I know, opportunities to do advocacy and domestic violence programs, and the School Exclusion Project at City University, that's another advocacy experience. And then if you're not in one of those programs and you're still in university, you can look at the options that are available for that kind of thing in university, or you could look to your local law centre and see if they need volunteers. Because what that will show is, again, that you're serious about this career path, and also that you are building up your advisory experience and advocacy experience. Those are the main things that come to my mind. I don't know if Remy might have some other suggestions.
No, I think Molly's covered everything.
All right, and so Remy, how did you decide, and how would you advise others to decide where to target applications, which chambers to apply to, and how many sets to apply to, and any observations on the pros and cons of gateway sets as against non-gateway sets?
Sure. I think the selection of chambers is really important. I think that's something you should spend some time on, and if you that's also something that I would recommend that you bounce ideas off your colleagues if you're on the bar course or at university. Talk to lecturers, talk to anyone who who has links to the profession, just to get a sense of which chambers there are and which ones might be the right fit for you. But really, ultimately, you need to do that research, and the best place to do that is to look at Chambers' website in order to work out what the main practice areas are. And to really look at that very carefully, because a lot of chambers will say they do lots and lots of different things, but ultimately they will do one or two or three things more than all the other things, and to work out what those are and if that's what you want to do. I think it's also important to be realistic about which chambers you apply to. I mean, for example, if you've only ever done mini pupillages that are in criminal sets, and all your experience is of doing criminal work, your application is less likely to be successful if you apply to a set that only does commercial law. So that's something to bear in mind, is to look at that very carefully. Another really important thing is, I think you should be looking at the profile pages of the most junior members of chambers at the sets that you're applying to. Because when you're applying for pupillage, that's ultimately where you will be in a few years. And you need to make sure that you've done all the sort of similar things that those tenants have done. One thing I would just caution, though, is when you're looking at a junior barrister's profile, there may be a lot of things there, a lot of prizes and a lot of things that you might not have got to yet. Just bear in mind that a lot of things, a lot of those prizes and scholarships might only be things that you can get later on in the process. So, for instance, there are prizes and scholarships that you get on the pupil course. So don't be put off if you see lots and lots and lots of scholarships that you've never even heard of. But also be realistic about what your profile would look like. It's also really important to consider that the ethos of a chambers that will vary a lot. There are lots of differences between chambers. Things like the gender balance as well. Some sets will be very, very male dominated. Some sets will have more of a sort of equal balance. I think those things are important. But also things like looking at the pupillage process. So I remember there were some sets that I was applying to that would state very clearly that they would take, for instance, 4 or 6 pupils with a view to making only 1 or 2 offers of tenancy. Other sets will say that they have a policy whereby they will take as many, they will offer as many tenancies in principle as there are pupils, provided you meet the standard. So all those things are relevant as well.
Molly, anything to add to that? And also, how would you go about researching different chambers that you might be thinking about applying to?
So in addition to what Remy has said about looking at the websites, I would agree entirely that is incredibly important, and I would say that it needs to be an in-depth look at the website, not just a cursory glance. You need to really look at the different members of chambers, different parts of the website. Other resources for researching chambers that I found particularly useful were the Chamber Student Guide, which they don't cover all chambers because I think it's a voluntary process that chambers get involved in, but they do have profiles of different sets, and they're kind of a bit more informal and give quite a good sense of the ethos of those sets, and I find that really invaluable in researching. And also the guides that basically rank chambers for different areas, I find that incredibly useful for finding the chambers that I was interested in. So I knew what kind of area of law I was interested in, and then I would use those to kind of look up what were the top rated sets in London, around the country, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, and then look at their profiles, and from there kind of generate a list of chambers that I was interested in applying for. And then again, I just reiterate talking to people and kind of word of mouth and getting a sense of what chambers are really like in that kind of practical way. And finally, mini pupillages are very obviously helpful in finding out about chambers.
All right, well, I agree with all of that, but let me just give you one caveat about chambers' websites. It's very important to look at them. It's very important to do all of your research about the chambers that you're applying to so that you know absolutely everything, or as much as you can know, about them. But please don't, when you're filling in your application forms, simply quote phrases from the website, because that's what everybody does. It doesn't let your application stand out, and it means that it looks like the only research you've done is to look at the website and copy down a quote and quote it back at us. And we read form after form after form, which has exactly the same choice quotes from directories or websites. So it's important to do it, but you're doing it for the right purpose, to inform yourselves about the chambers and so that you've got the knowledge about the sets of chambers that you're applying to, rather than just to tell chambers what's on their own websites, because they know that. Let's move on then to the written application stage. That's an incredibly important part of the process. Most applications, the vast majority of applications that fail at the written application stage. If you're getting through the written application stage, if you're getting to interviews, and particularly if you're getting to second round interviews, then our experience is that you will very likely secure a pupillage. We did some research last year, looking back over the last 5 or 6 years of our pupillage application rounds, to see if we could work out what had become of candidates who'd got through to our second round interviews but hadn't been offered pupillage with us. And that research showed that in almost every case, candidates had secured pupillage and indeed tenancy in sets of chambers. So once you're getting through to the pupillage stage, to the interview stage, you stand a very good prospect of getting pupillage. The trick, an important trick, is to get through the paper application stage. So let's just look at that. And Remy, what tips would you have on completing the all-important written application form?
I think I would underscore absolutely everything that Jeremy said. The paper application is crucially important. And for those of you who are looking to apply for pupillage this year, you should apply as much effort to that form as you would to a law exam or anything else that you've got this year of that magnitude. What you need to think about is that a barrister who is sitting in chambers on a pupillage committee will receive a big pile of applications, and they will be doing that work. That sort of sift will be done. Often it'll be after court. There isn't much time, and there'll be a lot of applications to go through. So it's absolutely crucial that you craft an application form that somebody can pick up, can read easily, that doesn't have to reread it 3 or 4 times because they don't understand what a particular sentence means or that it's difficult to understand. So really, the way that I would describe a pupillage application form is it is a piece of written advocacy, and you absolutely need to understand that and to craft it in that way. It is your one opportunity to put something in front of a barrister that says, I'm a really good candidate and you should absolutely interview me, because those interview slots are quite precious. I mean, there isn't a sort of a rule, but in general, I think chambers will interview somewhere between 5 and 15% of applicants that put in an application form. So to be in that very small pile of applications, you need to do absolutely everything right. So what I would emphasize is small mistakes, typos, typographical errors, grammatical mistakes, all those things are really, really important, because ultimately the person reading the form is going to be looking for reasons not to put you through. If the reality is there will be lots and lots of really good applications. Make it succinct, make it clear, and write it in such a way that the person will only need to read it once and it can read it quickly and understand what you're saying. Proofread it really carefully. Don't do it at the last minute. What you'll need to do is you'll need to do a number of different drafts and develop it over time. Have other people read it, as many people as you can. Family, friends, lawyers, if you know any, just send it out, get other people to tell you what they think about it. What you need to do is your application form will need to appeal to as wide a group of people as possible. So the more people you can have read it, the more feedback you can get, and the better the form will be. So I think those are my sort of top tips.
Molly, anything to add to that?
I think Remy's covered most of it. The last thing I would add is answer the question that is asked, which is something that is told to you constantly from day one of your undergraduate, for exams, for essays, for everything, and it applies equally to applications. And just really read the question carefully and actually answer that question.
All right. A couple of things I'd add to that. Firstly, word limits are limits, not targets. You're not going to be marked down if you have used fewer words than you're entitled to use. Indeed, if you've expressed something clearly and succinctly, then you're likely to get a much better response from the person reading it than if you've filled in absolutely every space you can possibly use. And the other thing is, I think sometimes there's a tendency for applicants to think that barristers like to use particularly complicated language, and they fill their application forms with slightly obscure turns of phrase and slightly unnatural uses of language. At least I hope they're unnatural, because it slightly worries me if people talk like that in normal life. Make your application form easy to read, simple language, and just express in a clear and succinct way the things you want to get across. As Remy says, it's a piece of written advocacy, and treat it as such. Now, there's some standard questions we have on our application form. I think almost all sets will ask in one form or another. One is typically, why do you want to be a barrister, or why do you believe you'll be a good barrister? And one is why you want to join the particular set of chambers. Now, in a sense, everything in your application form should be designed to explain or persuade the reader that you'll make a good barrister in that particular set of chambers. But Molly, what tips, if any, do you have in particular on those questions as to why you believe you'll be a good barrister, or why you want to join that particular set of chambers?
Well, in respect of the first question, why do you believe you'll make a good barrister? When I was doing the form, I put quite a lot of time into actually thinking about what is a good barrister and what the job of a barrister actually involves. And I think that's actually really important, to spend that time thinking about it, reading about the bar, reading about careers. That can be even through, a day in the life of the barrister. There's articles in newspapers about that kind of thing, and if you want to do the criminal bar, the secret barrister, the recent book that was published, that kind of thing gives you a sense of what the job is really like. And the reason that is so important is that you need to show, I think, that you actually understand what being a barrister involves and what is actually required to be a good one, and that it is not just about oral advocacy and public speaking skills. Obviously, that is extremely important, but it's also about incredibly good written skills, good communication skills, good time management skills, and good self-motivation, and also an ability to work in a self-employed capacity, which is not for everyone. And I actually think that in doing all of that, it will really help you figure out if this is something you really do want to do. So it kind of has a dual purpose in terms of helping you answer this question, but also making you think about, really seriously whether this is something that you do want to pursue. And so I think in doing that will kind of, it's about brainstorming and thinking about all those things, and then managing to get that across in a very clear and succinct way, hitting the key points of why you say you, drawing upon your own experience and your own education, everything else that's in your form, why that all shows that you will be a good barrister. And in respect to that last point, I think that is really important, to be able to draw on real life experiences and examples that show why you'll be a good barrister, because obviously anyone can just say that they have those skills, but it's much more impressive if you can actually point to something as to where you have shown those previously. In respect of why you want to join chambers, I think the key, and it's a very basic point, but my understanding is that this does sometimes come up in applications, is making sure you're not copying and pasting between application forms. You really need to answer that question individually for every single set of chambers, and it is a bit tedious, but it just has to be done, because I think it's very obvious very quickly if someone has copied and pasted from another application form. So tailor that answer to the chambers you're applying for. And again, it's kind of going back to the point of the research. If you've done your research, you should hopefully have a very good reason why you want to join that chambers.
Remy, anything else?
No, I agree with everything that Molly has said. I think those two questions are really, really important. And I think I'd really repeat what Molly said. That first question in particular, why do you want to be a good barrister? It is about you, but it's also to show and demonstrate that you know something about what being a barrister is, and why you think that you would be able to do that well. I think for the questions that gives you a little bit of space to write, if it's a 200 word limit, I think the word limit this year on the Gateway application is sets will be able to ask questions up to a 1,000 word limit, and sort of anything between 200 and 1,000. You're going to want to think about how you answer those, and I think there are different ways of doing it. So I remember when I was doing my application form, sometimes I would use numbered points. That's a really clear way to get a message across. But then you wouldn't want to do that for every question, because then it looks like you're just sort of answering the questions like a robot. But I think for this question, what I had said is something like, I think I will be a good barrister for these 4 reasons, and then just set out sort of in 4 sentences why you think that's the case. And that sort of sends a really clear message, and makes it easy to read. And on the question of why you want to join a specific set of chambers, do take the time for every single chambers to really understand who they are, what they do, and why you want to be part of that set.
Okay, so I'm sure everyone in this room will sail through the paper sift stage, having listened to Molly and Remy's tips. Let's look at the next stage, which is the interview stage. And what advice do you have, Remy, for candidates who've been offered an interview?
I have to say, I found this stage much more difficult to prepare for, because obviously when you've got your application form, you've got the questions and you've got the time to answer them and to do the research. When you're in the interview, you will only have 15 minutes, you won't know what the questions will be. And so in a sense, the temptation is, well, there isn't really any preparation that you can do. But that isn't the case. The approach that I took to preparing for interviews is the same approach I would take to preparing for any law exam. You absolutely can prepare. One way to prepare is to look at all of the topical legal issues that have come up, particularly around that practice area. Molly's mentioned already the fantastic book that came out this year by The Secret Barrister. All of you should read that. Of course, it's geared particularly towards sort of the criminal practice, but it raises bigger issues about access to justice and all the other things. The approach that I took is that over the space of a sort of 2 or 3 weeks, when I started getting interview offers, is that I would sort of draw up a list of the 10 or the 15 or the 20 main legal issues that have come up during the year, and just do a few bullet points on each of those, do a little bit of research, so that if I was asked a particular question, I was quite surprised at actually how often those particular topics would come up. So in the year I was applying, it was things like historic sex offences, it was things, I can't remember off the top of my head what it was 2 or 3 years ago, but you'll know for this year, lots of things have been going on, Brexit, lots and lots of things have been happening, and you'll need to understand how each of those events have unfolded and do the research, because you'd be surprised that when you go to different interviews, the same questions will come up. So that's the approach I would take. But also don't sort of write out your answers so that you sound like a robot in the interview. Leave yourself a bit of space to answer the question that is asked. I'm not sure if...
Molly, anything else? And also any advice on attending interviews?
Well, so just to add to that, in terms of the legal research, another thing is to sign up to the various different update blog services. So, for example, Inner Temple have a weekly news service where they round up the legal issues of important cases from that week. I think One Crown Office Row has a UK human rights blog. That's quite helpful too. And to just keep yourself updated and getting the emails in. And another thing I would just add is mock interviews, I think, are really important, and you should take every single opportunity that is given to do a mock interview. And I would also just highlight that if you aren't at the BPTC or even GDL stage yet, and if you are accepted onto the course, you can often avail of those career services before you even start. I know I did, and you should contact them and ask them. And in terms of attending interviews, the first obvious point is what you should wear. You should wear a suit, a full suit. It should not be particularly showy. It should just be a simple, plain suit. And essentially, I think the key is don't distract from what you're saying and what you're doing. You don't want to distract or kind of raise any particular eyebrows in the interview room. And ensure you arrive, obviously, in good time. I always took the approach of arriving at least an hour beforehand in the general vicinity, and then sitting in a coffee shop and preparing there. And you will see, once you start doing interviews, everyone else doing the same thing. So I think that's key, because what that means is that you're not rushing then to get to an interview, and that you have time to kind of centre yourself and be calm going in, and that's really, really important. And then the last thing is just try to, as best you can, relax before you go in, and whatever you need to do that, you kind of need to figure that out for yourself. It could be a breathing exercise. And another thing that I kind of did, which is quite embarrassing really, but was very helpful in the end, was before I went in, write down the 3 key points as to why I deserve this and why I should get this, to kind of boost your own confidence before you go in, and really make sure that you are clear kind of going in that they should be picking you. And it was amazing the kind of effect that had in my performance in terms of the confidence kind of building and portraying that across. And I mean, essentially, you're trying to sell yourself and advocate for yourself, and you should think of it like that, and not go in kind of being self-conscious about certain things, or self-deprecating is probably the better word. That's not the time for being self-deprecating. It's not a pupil interview.
Remy, anything else to add to that? And what about answering different types of interview questions or advocacy tests, for example? Do you have any advice in relation to that?
Yeah, I think most chambers will offer some sort of an advocacy exercise. So the typical ones would be often a plea and mitigation or a bail application. Civil chambers will ask you to do something, whether it's setting aside default judgment or application for relief from sanctions. And one of the difficulties here is that you'll all be at different stages. So those of you that have done the bar course will perhaps feel more comfortable doing something like that, and those of you who are still at university will, in some cases, never have heard of these applications or what you need to do. Now, chambers will, I think most chambers, if not all, will take into account what stage you're at. So there is that. But I think that if you haven't yet done the bar course, it's worth taking the time, and I think you should take the time just to get the basics on what those look like. And I think there are some really helpful blogs. I think there's a couple of BPTC lecturers that have blogs that will sort of give you the lowdown, the sort of 10 points on how to do a plea and mitigation or a bail application. But again, it's about being methodological. It's about applying what you know to the facts you're given. Often the way it would work is when you arrive at the interview, you'll be given the advocacy exercise and given 10 minutes or 15 minutes or 20 minutes to read through it and prepare. So the main point there is don't panic, read everything really carefully, and then just make some bullet points. And don't try and write out sort of a beautiful prose and sort of full sentences, because you won't have the time to do that, and also it won't be, you shouldn't sort of be reading out from a piece of paper when you're doing these. So I think just some, have sort of a page of bullet points at most when you go in to answer to do the advocacy exercise.
And Molly, and also what about other types of questions such as legal problem questions?
So I think one of the key things in the legal problem questions is to think about the basics of the legal question that you're being asked. Often it will be contract or tort, and that will be the kind of question, or perhaps judicial review kind of related question. Think about the basic legal principles that you need to hit, and think about it logically, kind of each step. And one thing I would say is that, in my experience, and this can actually sometimes be a bit more difficult if you perhaps did an undergraduate law degree and it's quite a few years since you did all those subjects. I know personally when I went into some interviews, I kind of went in with the most complex point that I could see in the question, and then didn't address, breach of, duty of care, breach of duty, causation, and then actually had to be brought back to it, and it doesn't really look good. So sometimes it's about just remembering the key legal principles, and if it is a long time since you've done those subjects, go back and remind yourself of the basic legal principles, and in terms of approaching it. And I would say that, in my experience, the questions are often kind of geared towards allowing you to do that with maybe a particularly complicated kind of matter thrown in the end, but it is about just approaching it logically, and also just trying to think very practically as well, to remember that this isn't an academic thing. It is about being a barrister, which is about the practicalities of what actually happen in practice and what you do. So think about those. I think as well in terms of ethics questions, I don't know, but ethical questions, again, quite tricky if you haven't done the bar course. If you haven't done the bar course, I would again recommend reading some of those blogs from BPTC lecturers that Remy just mentioned, potentially trying to borrow one of the books from the bar course that summarises all the professional ethics things and matters, and looking through the Bar Standards Board Code of Conduct, and probably one of the key points is that your duty, one of the core duties, is not to mislead the court. So bear that in mind when answering the ethical questions, and also bear in mind that sometimes those ethical questions will be implicit in the problem question. They won't be overt, and so you kind of need to go in with a mind to having thoughts about the ethical issues involved for the barrister in that case. And I have to say I did find that the ethical questions were in nearly every single interview I did, and were actually often quite tricky and kind of where you could get caught out not having thought about something. So I would definitely emphasise that.
Because I think to give you an example of sort of ethical questions, I was asked things like if I'm on a train on my way to court and I overhear my opponent on the phone talking to his client and saying, that his case is really weak because of this or that reason, how do I deal with that? I think another one I had is, I've made my arguments in court, the judge has retired to give judgment, and I found a new case that I think will help my opponent. What should I do? So they're really difficult questions to answer, and I think the only way you can really answer them is take the time to just have a look. If you haven't done the bar course, you can download on the BSB website the Code of Conduct, and just have a look at what the core duties are, and it's by applying those that you would know how to answer those questions. I think the last point I would make just on interviews is also look out for you will get totally wacky questions from some sets. I remember I was asked once in a Pupillage interview who would win in a fight between Batman and Superman. I was asked at one set which animal I would be if I could be any animal. And the thing is the trick is just not to get completely stumped and to give an answer that is intelligent and witty. It's very difficult, but that's what you'll be faced with. And if you're being asked that question as well, I think often sets will ask that question because after you've given all the really intelligent legal answers, what they really want to see as well is that you're somebody that's friendly, easy to work with, and that's your opportunity really. It's with those questions that you can show that you are, a friendly person, that actually the people that are interviewing you will want to work with you in the future.
What I would just add to that is, in terms of approaching that kind of question, don't take it too seriously. It is meant as a light-hearted question, so answer it in that kind of vein.
Yeah. Good. All right. Well, let me just wrap up before we take questions. As I said, we're very happy to take questions from you, but let me just wrap up with some overarching tips. The first three of these, at least, come with a bit of self-interest, so take them with that in mind. The first is that we publish on our website, the 5 Essex Court website, a review of our application process after we've done it each year, which is a fairly detailed look at every stage of the process, the written stage, what impressed us, what didn't, traps people fell into, through to the first round interview and the second round interview. And we set out pretty explicitly every question we asked and what we were looking for. And obviously the questions change each year, but what we're looking for doesn't really change, and the questions are designed to test that. So, as I say, it's a bit of self-interest and self-promotion, so apologies for that, but I do commend that to you to read and take from it what you will. The second is the Free Representation Unit. I'm a trustee of the Free Representation Unit, and I did, when I was at your stage, a lot of work as a volunteer for the Free Representation Unit. It is a fantastic opportunity for you to get real practical experience in advocacy in real life situations. And it's valuable first for your own self-development, secondly because you'll find out fairly rapidly whether this is a job you really want to do or you really don't want to do it. And if you really don't want to do it, believe me, you don't want to go through pupillage. And thirdly, it will give you an armoury of material that you can fall back on in interviews. We often ask those who've done through cases or the like to tell us about a case they've done, and those who are able to do that compellingly and show a real zeal for and enthusiasm for and aptitude for advocacy inevitably do very well. So that was the second tip I have, is the Free Representation Unit. The third tip is a book written by a colleague in Chambers, Georgina Wolfe, who's part of our pupillage committee. I regard her as my boss because she pretty much runs the show. She, with a co-author, has written a book called Path to Pupillage. All the proceeds go to Middle Temple Scholarship Fund, so it's for a good cause, and it's packed full of useful tips for applying for pupillage. So I thoroughly commend that to you. And the fourth tip I have, which isn't born out of self-interest in the way the first three are, is to watch advocacy. Tune into the Supreme Court feed or look at Supreme Court cases and the arguments that take place. Go to court and watch it. Do that before your interviews, because you will take on board something of the way in which we operate, and it's a very important learning experience. All of us learn throughout our careers from watching how others do advocacy, and it's never too early to start that process. So those are four additional tips I would offer.